My name is Ibtisam, and I'm 27 years old today. But on April 13th, 2017, when I was just 16, my twin sister and I experienced something no child should ever endure. Our own father sold us to a 60-year-old sheikh for money. This is how Jesus saved us from that nightmare. I grew up in a small village where the call to prayer echoed 5 times a day, and where being a good Muslim daughter meant obedience above all else. My twin sister and I were inseparable, sharing everything from our morning prayers to our secret dreams of maybe one day traveling beyond our dusty streets. We were raised to believe that Allah had a plan for us, that our Father knew what was best, and that questioning either was a sin that could damn our souls. Our father had once been a respected merchant in our community. I remember when I was younger, watching him return from the markets with his pockets full and his head held high. The neighbors would greet him warmly, and our mother would smile as she prepared elaborate meals to celebrate another successful day of business. Those were the days when we felt secure, when the future seemed bright and predictable. But gambling has a way of destroying everything good in a man's life. It started slowly, so gradually that we barely noticed at first. Father began staying out later, coming home with the smell of cigarettes and desperation clinging to his clothes. The money started disappearing. First, it was the little luxuries that vanished from our table. Then the good furniture was sold piece by piece. Mother stopped buying new fabric for our dresses, and we learned to make do with what we had. I watched my mother's face change during those months. The worry lines deepened around her eyes, and she began jumping every time there was a knock at our door. She would whisper urgent prayers under her breath while cooking, and I caught her crying more than once when she thought no one was looking. When we asked her what was wrong, she would force a smile and tell us that Allah was testing our family's faith. The debt collectors started coming regularly. They were not gentlemen, and their voices carried through our thin walls as they demanded payment from Father. I could hear him pleading, promising, making deals that he had no way of keeping. Each time they left, Father would emerge from these meetings looking older, more desperate, more willing to consider options that would have been unthinkable just months before. My sister and I tried to help in the only ways we knew how. We offered to find work, maybe cleaning houses or helping in the markets, but Father refused. In our culture, working daughters brought shame upon a family. We were supposed to remain pure and untouched until marriage, protected by our father's honor. The irony of this protection would become devastatingly clear later. The night that changed everything forever was a Tuesday in April. Father had been gone for 3 days, and when he returned, something in his eyes was different. There was a hardness there that I had never seen before, mixed with something that looked almost like relief. He called Mother into their room for a private conversation that lasted hours. We could hear Mother's voice rising and falling, sometimes pleading, sometimes sobbing. When they finally emerged, Father's face was set like stone, and Mother couldn't even look at us. He sat us down in our small living room and began speaking in a voice that sounded like it belonged to a stranger. He told us that he had found a solution to our family's problems, a way to honor us while securing our future. He spoke of a wealthy sheikh who was known for his generosity and wisdom, a man who could provide for us in ways that our current situation never could. At first, I didn't understand what he was really saying. The words seemed to float around the room without landing anywhere that made sense. Marriage, arrangement, honor, financial security. It wasn't until he mentioned our ages and the sheikh's willingness to take both of us that the horrible truth began to sink in. My sister grabbed my hand and I felt her trembling. We had heard whispers about such arrangements, stories told in hushed tones about girls who disappeared into wealthy households and were never seen again. But those were other families, distant relatives, cautionary tales that happened to people we didn't really know. We never imagined it could happen to us. I found my voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I asked Father how old this Sheikh was, and when he answered 63, the room seemed to spin around me. I was 16, my sister was 16. This man was older than our grandfather had been when he died. We begged, we pleaded, we promised to find work, to help pay the debts, to do anything except this one thing. But Father had already made his decision, and in his mind, he was being merciful. He could have sold just one of us, he said. Instead, he was allowing us to stay together, to support each other in our new life. Mother sat silent through our pleas, tears streaming down her face, but she never spoke up for us. Later, I would understand that she was as trapped in this system as we were, as powerless to change our fate as we were to escape it. The negotiations had already taken place, the money had already changed hands. The Sheikh expected us within the week, and Father made it clear that disappointing such a powerful man was not an option for our family's survival. Can you imagine being betrayed by the person who should protect you most? Can you imagine learning that your own father sees you not as his beloved daughter, but as a commodity to be traded when times get desperate? That night, as my sister and I held each other and cried, we felt something die inside us that we didn't even know we possessed. It was our innocence, our trust, our belief that we mattered as human beings rather than objects to be owned. The Sheikh's compound rose from the desert like a fortress, its high walls topped with decorative ironwork that I would soon realize served a more sinister purpose than mere ornamentation. As our father's borrowed truck approached the massive gates, my stomach churned with a mixture of terror and disbelief. The opulence was overwhelming. Marble fountains, manicured gardens, and servants in crisp white uniforms moved about their duties with practiced efficiency. It was more beautiful than anything I had ever seen, and yet it felt like we were approaching our own tomb. The Sheikh himself greeted us at the entrance, his expensive robes flowing as he walked. His beard was meticulously groomed and dyed black despite his age, and his eyes held a calculating coldness that made my skin crawl. He examined my sister and me the way a buyer might inspect livestock at market, nodding approvingly at Father while completely ignoring our obvious distress. When he smiled, his gold teeth gleamed, but there was no warmth in his expression, only satisfaction at a successful transaction. Father left us there that very afternoon. I will never forget watching his truck disappear through those gates, taking with it any hope we might have harbored that this was all some terrible mistake that could still be undone. The finality of that moment hit me like a physical blow. We were no longer daughters, we were property that had been transferred from one owner to another. The other wives received us with a mixture of pity and resignation. There were 4 of them, ranging in age from barely 20 to perhaps 40, and each one had her own story of how she had arrived at this place. Some had been sold like us, others had been given in marriage to settle family disputes or business arrangements. None of them seemed particularly happy, but they had all learned to survive within the confines of their gilded cage. Our assigned quarters were more luxurious than our family's entire house had been. Silk curtains, Persian rugs, a private bathroom with running water, and a balcony that overlooked the gardens. Under different circumstances, I might have felt grateful for such comfort. Instead, every beautiful detail felt like another bar in our prison. The windows had decorative metalwork that we quickly realized we could not bend or break. The doors locked from the outside. Even our balcony was positioned so that jumping would mean certain death on the rocks below. The Sheikh's expectations were made clear to us through the eldest wife, who had been appointed to train us in our new roles. We were to be available whenever he called for us. We were to be grateful for the privilege of serving such a generous man. We were to forget our previous lives and embrace our new purpose. Most importantly, we were never to attempt to contact our family or the outside world. The penalty for disobedience, she warned us, with genuine fear in her eyes, was severe. During our first week, they kept my sister and me separated during the day. This was part of the training process. They explained we needed to learn independence, to stop relying so heavily on each other. The real reason became clear soon enough. Together we gave each other strength and courage. Alone, we were more manageable, more likely to accept our fate without resistance. I was assigned to work with the Christian servant during my training period. Her name was Miriam, though she was careful about when and where she shared personal information. She was different from the other servants in ways that took me time to identify. While the others moved through their duties with the mechanical precision of people who had long since stopped hoping for anything better, Miriam carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed unshakable. Even in servitude, there was something free about her spirit. Miriam was kind to me in small ways. That meant everything during those dark days. She would slip me extra bread when the other servants weren't looking. She would hum softly while we worked, melodies that were somehow both mournful and hopeful. When I wept while scrubbing floors, she never told me to stop or reminded me to be grateful for my situation. Instead, she would work quietly beside me, her presence a comfort in itself. Our first escape attempt came during Ramadan, when the household routines were disrupted by the requirements of the holy month. My sister and I had been planning for weeks, memorizing the guards' schedules, identifying the weakest points in the compound security. We thought we were so clever, so careful in our preparations. We had no idea that others before us had tried the exact same approach. We were caught before we even reached the outer wall. The punishment was swift and designed to ensure we would never attempt such foolishness again. They separated us for 2 weeks, placing us in windowless rooms with minimal food and water. Worse than the physical discomfort was the psychological torture of not knowing whether my sister was alive or dead, whether she was suffering as I was suffering. When we were finally reunited, we both looked like ghosts of our former selves. The experience had broken something fundamental in our spirits. We began to believe that this truly was our fate forever, that Allah had abandoned us to this existence as punishment for some sin we couldn't identify. We prayed our 5 daily prayers mechanically, but the words felt empty, echoing off the walls of our hearts that had grown cold and hard. Every day felt like a year, every night like an eternity. We learned to move through our routines without thinking, to make ourselves invisible when the Sheikh's attention turned toward us, to find small comforts in shared glances and secret touches of hands when no one was watching. We stopped talking about escape. We stopped talking about our family. We stopped talking about anything that existed beyond these walls. The other wives tried to help us adjust, sharing survival strategies they had learned through their own years of captivity. They taught us which servants could be trusted and which ones reported everything back to the Sheikh. They showed us how to make ourselves useful enough to avoid punishment, but not so indispensable that we would never be allowed a moment's peace. Most importantly, They taught us how to disappear inside ourselves during the worst moments, how to protect the essential core of who we were, even when everything else was being taken away. We began to believe this was our fate forever. The days blended together in an endless cycle of servitude and survival, punctuated only by the Sheikh's increasingly frequent demands for our attention. Hope became a luxury we could no longer afford, and we learned to live without it, existing in a gray twilight between life and death that seemed like it would never end. It was during my 3rd month in captivity that Miriam began to share more than just kind gestures. We were cleaning the Sheikh's private library together, a room filled with religious texts and business documents that represented the 2 pillars of his power. As we dusted the ornate shelves, she began to hum again, but this time the melody was different. It was softer, more tender than her usual songs, and there was something about it that made me pause in my work. When I asked her about the song, she glanced around nervously before whispering that it was a hymn about someone who loved children and women, someone who cared deeply about people who were suffering. She told me his name was Jesus, and the way she said it was unlike anything I had ever heard. There was reverence there, yes, but also an intimacy that seemed impossible when speaking about God. In Islam, Allah was distant, powerful, demanding of submission, but when Miriam spoke of Jesus, it sounded like she was talking about a friend. I was shocked by her boldness in speaking about a Christian deity, and initially I recoiled from such blasphemy. I had been taught that Christians were people of the book who had been led astray, that Jesus was merely a prophet who had been wrongly elevated to divine status. The very idea of God having a son was offensive to everything I had been raised to believe, but something in Miriam's voice, something in the way her entire countenance changed when she spoke of him, made me curious despite my religious training. Over the following weeks, our conversations during work time became the highlight of my days. Miriam would tell me stories about Jesus that were unlike anything I had heard in the Quran. She spoke of a man who defended women caught in adultery, who welcomed children when others wanted to send them away, who touched lepers and ate with tax collectors and prostitutes. Most remarkably, she told me about how he treated women not as property or sources of temptation, but as beloved daughters worthy of respect and dignity. The story that affected me most deeply was about a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. In our culture, such a condition would have made her permanently unclean, unable to touch anyone or participate in religious life. But when this woman touched Jesus' clothing, he didn't recoil in disgust or demand to know who had contaminated him. Instead, he turned to her with compassion and called her daughter. Daughter. Not servant, not property, not burden, but daughter. I found myself thinking about these stories during the long, empty hours when I wasn't working. The Jesus that Miriam described seemed to care specifically about people like my sister and me, people who had been abandoned and abused by those who should have protected them. When I shared these conversations with my sister during our brief moments together, I could see the same hunger in her eyes that I felt growing in my own heart. The breaking point came on a particularly difficult night in late November. The Sheikh had been especially demanding, and my sister had returned to our shared room in tears, her spirit more broken than I had ever seen it. We held each other and wept, feeling completely abandoned by Allah, by our family, by everyone who should have cared about our suffering. In our desperation, we found ourselves questioning everything we had been taught about God's mercy and justice. That night, for the first time in my life, I spoke to someone other than Allah. The words felt strange and dangerous on my tongue, but I was beyond caring about religious propriety. Jesus, I whispered into the darkness, if you're real, if you really care about girls like us, please help us. We have nowhere else to turn. My sister joined me in this desperate prayer, and together we asked this foreign God to do what our own God seemed unwilling or unable to do. What happened next was subtle but unmistakable. A peace settled over our room that had nothing to do with our circumstances. The fear that had been our constant companion for months seemed to recede, replaced by something I can only describe as hope. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, but it was real, and it was there, warming us from the inside out in a way that made no logical sense. The next morning, Miriam noticed the change in us immediately. When I told her about our prayer, tears filled her eyes, and she embraced us both with a joy that was infectious. She began to tell us more about Jesus, about his love and sacrifice, about how he came specifically to set captives free and to heal the brokenhearted. She explained that he wasn't just another prophet, but God himself who had chosen to experience human suffering so that he could truly understand and redeem it. Over the following weeks, we began to pray to Jesus regularly. Each time, we felt that same inexplicable peace, that same sense of being loved and valued in ways that our previous religion had never offered us. Miriam shared verses from her hidden Bible that spoke directly to our situation, promises that God would rescue the oppressed and give beauty for ashes. Have you ever been so desperate that you'd try anything? That's where we found ourselves clinging to hope in a person we had been taught to reject, finding comfort in prayers that our upbringing told us were forbidden. But desperation has a way of stripping away everything except what actually works. And Jesus was working in our lives in ways that were undeniable. We began to understand that our suffering hadn't gone unnoticed, that there was someone who cared about our pain and was actively working to address it. This wasn't the distant demanding a law of our childhood, but a God who had chosen to enter into human suffering and transform it from the inside out. For the first time since arriving at the Sheikh's compound, we felt hope stirring in our hearts. Not hope that our circumstances would necessarily change immediately, but hope that we were loved, that we mattered, that our story wasn't over yet. Jesus was beginning to change us from the inside out, preparing us for something that we couldn't yet imagine, but that would prove to be more miraculous than anything we had dared to dream. The night of April 13th, 2017 began like any other night in our captivity. The evening call to prayer had echoed across the compound. Dinner had been served and cleared away, and the Sheikh had retired to his study to conduct his usual business calls. My sister and I were in our room, quietly reciting the verses that Miriam had taught us, when we heard the first rumble of thunder in the distance. What started as a gentle desert rain quickly intensified into something far more powerful. The wind began to howl around the compound's walls, and within an hour, we were in the midst of the most violent sandstorm I had ever experienced. The electricity flickered once, twice, and then died completely, plunging the entire estate into absolute darkness. In the chaos that followed, we could hear shouting from various parts of the compound. Emergency generators should have kicked in immediately, but something had gone wrong with the backup power system. The sophisticated security cameras that monitored every corner of our prison had gone dark. The electronic locks that kept us confined were now powerless. For the first time since our arrival, we found ourselves in a compound that was truly vulnerable, but the storm alone wouldn't have been enough to create our opportunity. What made this night different was what happened to Hassan, the head of security. He was a massive man who took his duties seriously, and under normal circumstances, even a power outage wouldn't have prevented him from maintaining strict control over the compound. But that evening, Hassan had fallen violently ill with what appeared to be severe food poisoning, leaving him bedridden and unable to coordinate this security response. With Hassan incapacitated and the storm creating chaos, the remaining guards were scattered and disorganized. Some were dealing with flooding in the lower levels of the compound. Others were trying to secure outdoor equipment and vehicles that were being damaged by the wind and sand. The careful, systematic surveillance that normally made escape impossible had dissolved into confusion and panic. My sister and I looked at each other in the darkness of our room, and without speaking, we both knew that this was the moment we had been praying for. The door that had been electronically locked was now standing open. The hallways that were usually monitored by multiple cameras were now invisible to our captors. The guards who normally patrolled our wing of the compound were nowhere to be seen. We moved quickly but carefully, gathering the few possessions we couldn't bear to leave behind. I grabbed the small piece of paper where I had written down the Bible verses that Miriam had shared with us, and my sister took the tiny sewing kit that had belonged to our grandmother. These were our only tangible connections to hope and to the life we had known before this nightmare began. As we crept through the darkened hallways, every step felt like it was guided by an invisible hand. We should have become lost in the maze of corridors that we had only seen under escort, but somehow we found our way unerringly towards the service areas where we knew the staff entrances were located. When we encountered obstacles like a locked door or a pile of debris from the storm, alternative paths seemed to open up before us just when we needed them most. The most remarkable moment came when we reached the kitchen area near one of the service exits. There was a guard stationed there who should have seen us immediately, but he was fast asleep at his post, his head resting on his arms as if he had been drugged. We crept past him so closely that we could hear his breathing, but he never stirred. Later, we would learn that he claimed to have no memory of falling asleep and couldn't explain how two teenage girls had walked past him without being detected. The service door that led to the delivery courtyard was our final obstacle, and it was the one we had been most worried about. This door was always locked and required a key that only senior staff members possessed. But when we tried the handle, it turned easily in our hands. Someone had left it unlocked, though no one would ever admit to having done so. Once outside, the full force of the storm hit us. The sand was like needles against our skin, and the wind was so strong that we had to hold on to each other to avoid being separated. But even in the midst of this natural fury, we felt a supernatural peace that kept us moving forward. We had memorized the layout of the compound during our months of captivity, and we knew that the main road lay to the east, beyond a stretch of open desert that we would have to cross on foot. The journey across that desert was the most terrifying and miraculous experience of our lives. The storm that had created our opportunity for escape was also trying to kill us as we fled. We couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, and the wind kept changing direction in ways that should have left us completely disoriented. But somehow we kept moving in the right direction, as if we were being led by an invisible guide who knew exactly where we needed to go. When our water ran out after several hours of walking, we should have collapsed from dehydration. Instead, we stumbled upon a small oasis that wasn't marked on any of the maps we had studied. The water was clean and cool, and there was even some shelter from the wind where we could rest for a few minutes before continuing our journey. As dawn began to break and the storm finally began to subside, we could see the lights of a small town in the distance. We had been walking all night through some of the most inhospitable terrain in our region, guided by nothing but faith and desperation, and we had somehow found our way to safety. It was as if invisible hands were guiding us every step of the way. We knew that what we had experienced wasn't just luck or coincidence. This was the Jesus that Miriam had told us about, the one who came to set captives free, actively working to deliver us from our bondage. We were witnessing firsthand the power of the God who had heard our desperate prayers and had chosen to respond with a miraculous rescue. We knew Jesus was with us every step, carrying us when we were too weak to carry ourselves, protecting us from dangers we couldn't even see, and leading us toward a freedom that we were only beginning to understand. The small town we had stumbled into was called Al-Nur, and it was there that our lives truly began again. Exhausted and covered in sand, we had approached the first building we saw, which turned out to be a Christian mission house run by a gentle woman named Sister Catherine. When she opened the door and saw two teenage girls standing on her doorstep, bedraggled and clearly in distress, she didn't ask questions first. She simply opened her arms and welcomed us inside. Sister Catherine's first concern was our physical well-being. She drew us warm baths, gave us clean clothes, and prepared a meal while we told her our story in halting, fearful whispers. We were terrified that she might turn us away, or worse, contact the authorities who would return us to the Sheikh. But as we spoke, her eyes filled with tears of compassion, and she assured us that we were safe, that no one would take us back to that life against our will. That first week in the mission house was like learning to breathe again after months of suffocation. For the first time in nearly a year, we could move freely from room to room without asking permission. We could speak to each other without whispering. We could eat when we were hungry and sleep when we were tired. These simple freedoms, which most people take for granted, felt like the greatest luxuries imaginable. But the most profound healing came through our introduction to the gospel message. Sister Catherine sat with us each evening, reading from her Bible and explaining the love of Jesus in ways that spoke directly to our wounded hearts. She told us that we were not damaged goods or ruined women, despite what our culture might say about girls who had experienced what we had endured. Instead, we were beloved daughters of the Most High God, precious in His sight and worthy of love and dignity. The moment when I truly accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior came during our second week at the mission house. Sister Catherine had been reading from the book of Isaiah about how God gives beauty for ashes and joy instead of mourning. As she read those words, something broke open inside my chest, and I felt the presence of Jesus so powerfully that I began to weep uncontrollably. In that moment, I understood that everything Miriam had told me was true. Jesus wasn't just another prophet or religious figure. He was God Himself, who had chosen to experience human suffering so that He could rescue people like me from the deepest darkness. I felt His love washing over me like warm sunlight after a long, cold night, and I knew that I wanted to belong to Him completely. My sister experienced her own moment of surrender just days later. We were praying together in the small chapel of the mission house when she suddenly fell to her knees and cried out to Jesus, asking Him to save her and make her His own. The transformation in her face was immediate and undeniable. The fear and hardness that had marked her features for months began to melt away, replaced by a peace that seemed to glow from within. Our baptism ceremony took place on a beautiful Sunday morning in May, just over a month after our escape. Sister Catherine had contacted other believers in the area, and despite the risks involved in attending such a ceremony, nearly 20 Christians gathered to witness our public declaration of faith. As I was lowered into the water and then raised up again, I felt like I was literally being born again. The old Ibtisam, the frightened girl who had been sold and enslaved, was dying. The new Ibtisam, the daughter of the King of Kings, was rising to life. I felt like I was being born again, literally. The terror that had been my constant companion for so many months was replaced by an inexplicable joy that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me. I finally understood what it meant to be truly free, not just from physical captivity, but from the spiritual bondage that had kept me trapped even before I ever saw the Sheikh's compound. But following Jesus came with immediate and serious costs. Word of our conversion spread quickly through the networks that connected our small community to the larger region. Within weeks, we began receiving death threats from family members who saw our embrace of Christianity as the ultimate betrayal of our family's honor. Father sent messages through intermediaries, promising that if we returned to Islam and agreed to go back to the Sheikh, we might be forgiven. If we refused, we would be considered dead to our family forever. The threats escalated when it became clear that we had no intention of renouncing our new faith. Uncle arrived at the mission house one evening with several other men, demanding that Sister Catherine turn us over to them immediately. They claimed that, as our family members, they had the right to take us home and correct our thinking. Sister Catherine stood firm, refusing to hand us over despite their increasingly aggressive threats. That night, we were moved to a safe house in another town, beginning a period of hiding that would last for several months. The Christian underground network in our region was more extensive than we had ever imagined, and believers risked their own safety to keep us protected from those who wanted to drag us back to our old life. Living in hiding was difficult in ways that were different from, but sometimes as challenging as our captivity had been. We couldn't go outside freely, couldn't contact anyone from our past, couldn't even use our real names in most situations. But the crucial difference was that we had chosen this isolation in order to follow Jesus. We were hiding not because we were prisoners, but because we were free women who had made a decision that others wanted to punish us for. During those months in hiding, our faith grew stronger rather than weaker. We spent hours each day reading the Bible and praying, and we began to understand that Jesus didn't just want to save us from our circumstances. He wanted to save our souls, to transform us from the inside out, to make us into the women He had always intended us to be. Look inside your own heart right now. Do you know this kind of transformation? Have you experienced the moment when everything you thought you knew about God and yourself suddenly becomes clear? Jesus didn't just rescue us from physical slavery. He rescued us from spiritual death and gave us abundant life that no one could ever take away from us again. The hardest lesson I had to learn as a new Christian was forgiveness. For months after our escape, I carried a burning hatred in my heart for Father, for the Sheikh, for everyone who had participated in our suffering. This anger felt righteous and justified, and I held on to it like a treasure that no one had the right to take from me. But Jesus began to show me that this hatred was a prison of its own, one that would keep me captive even in my freedom. The breakthrough came during a Bible study session with Sister Catherine, when she read Jesus' words about forgiving those who hurt us. I remember arguing with her, insisting that some sins were too great to forgive, that God couldn't possibly expect me to extend mercy to people who had shown me none. But she gently pointed me to the cross, reminding me that Jesus had forgiven even those who crucified him, and that His forgiveness of my own sins was the foundation of my new life. The process of forgiving Father was the most difficult spiritual battle I had ever fought. Every time I tried to release my anger toward him, memories of his betrayal would flood back and the rage would return stronger than before. But gradually, through prayer and the patient guidance of Sister Catherine, I began to understand that forgiveness wasn't about excusing his actions or pretending they hadn't hurt me. It was about releasing my right to revenge and trusting Jesus to handle the justice that I couldn't pursue myself. The day I finally forgave Father completely was one of the most liberating experiences of my life. The weight that had been crushing my chest for months simply lifted away, and I felt a freedom that was even more profound than our physical escape from the compound. I realized that holding on to hatred had been like drinking poison and expecting Father to die from it. In forgiving him, I was setting myself free. It was during this period of healing and growth that we began to understand why God had allowed us to endure such suffering. Our story wasn't just about our own rescue, it was about something much larger, a calling that we were only beginning to glimpse. Sister Catherine started bringing us into contact with other women who had survived similar experiences, and we discovered that our testimony had power to bring hope to people who had given up believing that escape was possible. The first time we shared our story publicly was at a small gathering of believers in a neighboring town. My hands shook as I stood up to speak, and my voice was barely above a whisper for the first few sentences. But as I began to describe how Jesus had heard our desperate prayers and orchestrated our miraculous escape, I could see hope kindling in the eyes of women who had thought they were beyond help. That night, 3 women approached us privately to share their own stories of abuse and captivity, and we realized that our suffering had prepared us to minister to people that others might not know how to reach. Our testimony began to spread throughout the underground Christian network, and we were invited to speak at safe houses and secret gatherings across the region. Each time we told our story, we met women and girls who were trapped in situations similar to what we had experienced. Some were living in forced marriages, others were being held as domestic slaves. All of them needed to hear that there was a God who saw their suffering and had the power to set them free. This work was dangerous. The same people who wanted to punish us for our conversion were also furious about our efforts to help other women escape similar situations. We received constant threats, and we had to change locations frequently to stay ahead of those who wanted to silence us. But with each woman we helped, with each testimony we shared, we became more convinced that this was exactly why God had allowed us to walk through our own valley of shadows. The safe house that we eventually established became a refuge for dozens of women over the following years. Some stayed for a few days while we arranged safe passage to other locations. Others remained for months while they healed from trauma and learned new skills that would allow them to build independent lives. Every woman who walked through our doors reminded us of ourselves on that night when we had stumbled into Sister Catherine's mission house, desperate and broken, but still capable of being restored. One of the most powerful aspects of our ministry was introducing these women to Jesus. Many of them came to us having given up on God entirely, convinced that if He existed at all, He must not care about their suffering. We were able to share from our own experience that God hadn't abandoned them, that He had been with them in their darkest moments, and that He had plans for their future that were filled with hope and purpose. Watching women accept Jesus as their Savior became the greatest joy of our lives. We witnessed transformation after transformation as the love of Christ healed wounds that seemed beyond repair. Women who had arrived at our safe house, broken and hopeless, left as confident daughters of the King, equipped not just to rebuild their own lives, but to help others who were still trapped in darkness. Our nightmare became our testimony of Jesus' power. Every scar on our hearts became a credential that allowed us to minister to women who might not trust someone who hadn't walked a similar path. Our suffering, which had once seemed meaningless and cruel, was transformed into a source of hope and healing for countless others. I'm asking you, just as a sister would, do you know this Jesus who has the power to transform even the worst circumstances into something beautiful? Do you understand that no situation is so dark that his light cannot penetrate it? No bondage so strong that he cannot break it? Our story is proof that Jesus is still in the business of setting captives free, still willing to move heaven and earth to rescue his beloved children. No matter how dark your situation, no matter how trapped you feel, no matter how convinced you are that your circumstances will never change, Jesus can save you too. He saved 2 Muslim girls from slavery, and he can save anyone who calls upon his name with a sincere heart. Will you open your heart to Jesus today? Will you allow him to transform your pain into purpose, your suffering into a testimony that can bring hope to others? This is Ibtisam, and this is my testimony of the God who sets captives free, who gives beauty for ashes, and who never stops pursuing his lost children until he brings them safely home.